So I'm Ned Hall. I'm the chair of the philosophy department here at Harvard. I'd like to welcome you all to the 2017 Whitehead lectures. I want to say just a little bit about where these lectures came from. And I'm just going to ruthlessly plagiarize from Warren Goldfarb, who sort of described the genesis of these lectures quite well some time ago. The Alfred North Whitehead lectures were established through the generosity of Edwin Bechtel of the Harvard College class of 1905, a great benefactor of the department, who loved philosophy, but was grateful for the advice he received from William James not to make a career in it. He wound up doing something far more lucrative. And I will just note off to the side, evidently we have a new, if somewhat mercenary, reason for cautioning our undergraduates against graduate school, right? We might be depriving ourselves of future benefactors. The Whitehead endowment reflects the esteem Mr. Bechtel had for Whitehead, whom he came to know after Whitehead joined the Harvard faculty in the 1920s. In his gift, Mr. Bechtel stipulated that the Whitehead lecturer be a, quote, distinguished scholar or other qualified person. I think we've met that bar. Who would give a lecture on a philosophical subject. Apparently, a lecture could be a scattered object, because our lecture is going to extend over today and tomorrow. So that's what I wanted to say by way of background about this event. By way of introducing Tim Williamson from Oxford, I'm not going to give you a long bio, but I'm going to sort of offer some remarks about the nature of philosophical success and progress, because his visit is an occasion for contemplating the nature of philosophical success, perhaps with just a touch of envy. Now, when we think about, we philosophers are often beset with a bit of sort of angst and existential anxiety about whether we actually ever do make progress or whether we are actually ever achieve success. And I think if you measure success in the way that's perfectly appropriate and common in other fields, in particular in the sciences, then things look pretty gloomy. Over there, the success of a career is measured by the extent to which your work convinces the field to endorse certain interesting positions or theories. And if that were our measure, I'm afraid, Tim, we'd have to judge you not an abject failure, but we could, if we're thinking Tim's success hinges upon how many people believe that epistemicism about vagueness is true, this would be a tough standard to meet. I will say that I think I may be convinced that epistemicism about vagueness is true, but I'm a crass and logico-linguistically unsophisticated philosopher of science, so I'm not sure my vote counts. But at any rate, this is the wrong standard for philosophy. And of course, this is a bit of a straw man. The idea that philosophy ought to employ that kind of measure of success is, I think, sort of deeply confused. And seeing one reason why it's confused will help make clear what I think is so admirable about Tim's contributions to philosophy. So to begin with this observation, I think it's built into our self-conception as philosophers, of course, that we question assumptions, we strive to unearth presuppositions. When we talk to parents of prospective concentrators about why it's okay for their kids to study philosophy, we often emphasize that a distinctive skill you get is unearthing assumptions that would have gone unnoticed but for your efforts. So when we think about that self-conception, it's not surprising that, given that self-conception, that whenever it happens that a substantive philosophical position takes on the status of orthodoxy within some field of philosophy, there is, at that point, a very, very strong built-in incentive to dispute that position. If something's orthodoxy, it's our job to dispute it. And ideally, of course, one wants to dispute it with argument. So it's no wonder, given that we don't agree, so that we don't achieve success as measured by convergence on opinion about some interesting matter. As soon as there is sufficient agreement among philosophers about some interesting philosophically substantive matter, that just means that someone's got a dissertation project, right? Finding out why that agreement is confused. But of course, it won't do, if you want to achieve philosophical progress and success, just to dispute a widely shared position, even with argument. You need to do more. You need to offer a clearly articulated alternative to it, an alternative that is at least to some extent new. And the standards for success, for real success in philosophy, are in fact much higher than this, as I think we all recognize. You must also offer arguments for your alternative, and those arguments should be laid out with sufficient care and precision that no philosophical reader is left in any doubt about how to assess the arguments. And those arguments should contain such insights and point to connections to other philosophical topics in such a way that even though not everyone will be convinced of your position, unless something has gone badly wrong with the field, a consensus emerges that your position must be reckoned with, that from this point forward, no one can count as having a proper understanding of the philosophical topic in question unless they understand the nature and merits of your position. So there's a kind of success in philosophy that I think is rarely achieved, but is something that we genuinely aspire to, that consists, for short, in reshaping the collective philosophical understanding of what's at stake. So by that standard, that much more appropriate standard, Tim's work is beautifully successful. And there are many examples I could talk about at length, but I'll just mention a couple. His work on vagueness, arguing that we should see vague language as fundamentally an epistemic phenomenon, has completely reshaped the way people address that phenomenon. His work on knowledge targeted what at the time was a widely shared assumption that states of knowledge are to be understood as somehow constituted by states of true belief that have some other feature. And Tim has succeeded in convincing people to rethink that and to take very seriously the power, the analytical power that can emerge if you flip things around and take knowledge itself as a fundamental analysans of other mental states as well. And we could go on like this. So I think Tim is an exemplar of how philosophy can make a certain kind of progress, the progress that consists in reshaping our conception of what's at stake, in generating genuine understanding. So I think we can look forward over today and tomorrow to what I hope will be several intense hours worth of novel philosophical understanding. So I'm going to stop there, and with that, please join me in welcoming Tim Williamson.
Well, thank you for that. I feel that Ned has left me in the role of Cassandra, doomed to speak the truth but not to be believed. And I warn you, those philosophical Troys will fall. So it's a great honor to be invited to give these lectures. Of course, notoriously, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and I did requisition the Whiteheadian phrase speculative philosophy for a recent lecture of mine. But I thought it would be a bit too in your face to do that on his home turf, so I'm not going to give that lecture. I'm going to be talking about various issues connecting normativity and belief, not perhaps the most foundational issues about what grounds, in some sense, such norms of belief as there might be, but rather structural issues about the sort of logical form that these norms might have, with the excuse that if we're confused or wrong about the logical structure of norms that we're talking about, if there are such norms, then our reasoning about them is likely to go haywire. So we better be clear about these matters. Of course, there's been quite a lot of recent work connecting these issues. I mean, for example, there's Kripke's work on the connections between intentionality and normativity, which has generated a huge discussion. And perhaps more recently in epistemology, I think the overtly normative character of the notion of justification, which plays an enormous role in the field, has become a focus of discussion. And lots of interesting things have emerged from that sort of work, but I think there have also been some confusions, and I hope to sort out some of those, even if you don't believe me. So let me just say a few words about the notions of belief and normativity that I'm going to be working with. So when I'm talking about belief, what I have in mind is outright or flat-out belief, as some people sometimes say. I'm concerned with the state of belief, not with the not norms, as it were, about the content of belief, independent of the state. I'm taking it that the kind of belief that we're talking about probably shouldn't be reduced to some kind of probabilistic notion, such as a credence of 90% or above, or something like that. But that isn't going to be doing anything much, at least in today's lecture. Will be more relevant tomorrow. I'm also going to take it that belief is a fairly primitive thing, that a state that young children and non-human animals can be in. It's, as it were, it's not something that you have to be some kind of responsible agent in some demanding sense to have. Again, that's not going to be at the forefront of the discussion, but it's worth bearing in mind. The norms that I'm going to be talking about are what one might think of as norms of non-defectiveness, as it were, what it takes for a belief not to be defective in some distinctive sense. They might, in some broad sense, be functional norms. I'm not going to say much more than that to characterize just where they come from or what their underlying metaphysical nature is. But just negatively, I want to say that the norms that I will be talking about, they are not moral norms, they're not prudential norms, they're not consequentialist norms of some kind. They're not all things considered norms, though given that there are such norms as I'll be talking about, they will have consequences, surely, for all those other sorts of norms. I'm going to talk about a range of norms which might well be rivals to each other when we got down to it, but I want to keep several of them in play because I want to highlight structural issues that apply quite similarly to norms that are different from each other in their specific content. The ones that I want to start with, and despite the fact that I'm starting with, that I in fact think are the ones that we should finish with, and in some let's say stick with, not dump, are wide scope norms. So these are oughts or shoulds that govern a whole conditional, a material conditional. So the truth norm, which is perhaps the one that's been most extensively discussed, is just the norm not to have untrue beliefs. The knowledge norm is a norm not to have unknowledgeable beliefs. In other words, not to believe P without knowing P. And the evidence norm is not to believe without evidence. So, as I say, I'm not today concerned with deciding between those three norms. It's worth noting that on plausible assumptions, I mean, such as that oughts are closed under logical or broadly logical consequence, that the knowledge norm entails the other two norms. I mean, knowledge entails truth, and I'm also taking it that it entails the level of evidence that's at issue in the evidence norm. So if you violate the truth norm or the evidence norm, you also violate the knowledge norm. And I mean, that might be the basis of an argument for the knowledge norm on the grounds that it provides a satisfying, a unifying explanation of the pull of both the truth norm and the evidence norm, neither of which entails the other, because I'm taking it that you can have, as it were, the level of evidence that we're concerned with is not one which requires truth, that you can have evidence for something false. Of course, there are many philosophers who regard the knowledge norm as wildly over-demanding, and again, that will be more at issue tomorrow than today. If one thinks in terms of the standard of justification, then the truth norm is not usually conceived as a justification norm. The knowledge norm is a sort of hardline externalist standard for epistemic justification, and in particular for doxastic justification. It, as it were, concerns the state of belief and its status, not just its content. We could, I mean, as it stands, the evidence norm is what would be called a norm of propositional justification, because it just says you shouldn't believe without having some evidence for the believed proposition. But of course, you could have evidence for it, but believe it on some completely independent and totally irrational ground. But I mean, we could beef it up to require that you believe P because you have evidence for P or something like that. But I'm not going to be concerned with that subtlety here. The first structural issue that I want to discuss about these is the difference between these as it were, single norms conceived as universal generalizations over all propositions and agents, presumably, versus a different way of thinking about them as families or of norms, or perhaps norm schemata, where the individual instances are norms for particular propositions and perhaps also for particular agents. So on the handout, I've indicated these, as it were, instances by subscript for the relevant proposition. I haven't made the believer explicit there, but you could if you wanted to. And I think this isn't just a matter of distinctions for the sake of distinctions. There are cases where it really makes a difference how one's thinking of these. And in particular, there are beliefs that you can have which, as it were, satisfy the relevant instance of the given norm for that believed proposition, but which is such that if you do believe that proposition, then you violate the corresponding universal generalization. So, I mean, a simple case of that is the belief that you have a false belief. I mean, that's a belief that I have about myself. I think it's a pretty reasonable belief for any normal human being to have, and I take it we all think, at least in the case of other people, that if they believe that they have false beliefs, they're right. So that belief can satisfy the truth norm, even though, of course, if you have that belief, it guarantees that you violate the truth norms, because if either that belief itself is false, or if it's true, then because of what it says, you have an untrue belief. And indeed, I think the same applies at the level of knowledge, and in many cases it seems reasonable to say that one knows that one has false beliefs, and of course you don't know which they are, but you know that you have some. I mean, for example, you may know that some large collection of your beliefs form a jointly inconsistent set, so that at least one of them is false. I mean, let's bracket issues about bivalence here. And for example, in the case of various sorts of paradoxes, there are. All the things that we believe together lead to some kind of contradiction, and so at least one of them is false. And in some cases, those beliefs are too deeply embedded for us just to say that oh well, we'll suspend belief on all of them. I mean, that would be a worse catastrophe than carrying on with inconsistency. I remember Elizabeth Anscombe once describing someone she'd actually known who had inconsistent beliefs and was absolutely tortured by the fact, and just couldn't get himself to drop any of them, felt agonized by what he saw as his irrationality, but that was where he was stuck. So I think these logical issues about these sorts of beliefs which, as it were, having which entail violation of the universal generalization, but nevertheless satisfy the relevant instance of it for the given proposition, they're going to play out in a somewhat more complex way in the case of a standard of evidence that doesn't require truth, if you think about the evidence norm. But I think the overall lessons are likely to be similar. So as it were, the general picture is that the belief that one has defective beliefs need not itself be defective, and that's because it satisfies the relevant, as it were, particular norm for that proposition. I think it's worth thinking about the analog of this for promising. I mean, I like thinking about the norm of promise keeping because it's so explicit what the norm requires in the given case. I mean, as it were, it requires that if you promise to fire, then you fire. That's it. And I take it that the analog would be something like promising to break at least one promise, which is something that you could. I mean, I could promise you to do that, and I could keep my promise to you. I mean, I might break my promise to someone else, but as it were, that's their problem. So the thing is, in such a case, if we think of the norm not as just a universal generalization that you should keep all your promises, but as having these, but as we're being evaluated instance by instance, then it's much easier to understand what's going on in these cases. I should say just a little bit about how I'm conceiving the norm of promise keeping, because I'll use that analogy in one or two other places as well. So I am not thinking of promise keeping as a moral norm at all, even though it's, of course, something which has moral consequences. And there may be moral issues. Well, there obviously are moral issues about keeping your promises. But the way I'm understanding it, the nature of promise keeping itself, of promising itself, involves a specific obligation to the promisee, which I see has been auto-incorrected to the promise on the handout, to keep your promise to them. And as it were, the institution of promising itself doesn't care about the content of the promise. So if I promise you to torture and kill the innocent, as it were, from the point of view of the institution of promising, I'm just as bound by that promise as by any other. And as it were, morality can have its say later. But just if we're just thinking about this, if you like, pre-moral obligation that one enters into in promising, it's irrespective of the content. And I think I mean, in a way, it's quite helpful also to think of the analogy between believing its norm and the norm of promise keeping in this way, that as it were, if you don't believe P, then there's no belief to assess. There's no belief whose normative status is in question, or relevantly. And similarly, if you don't make a promise, then there's no the issue of promise keeping or otherwise doesn't arise. Now, I think those wide scope norms that I've been talking about seem very straightforward in their content, and in my view, they're the natural ones to go for. But in the literature on norms of belief, it's almost standard to, perhaps even the word almost isn't needed, to be dissatisfied with those norms. And typically what people say is, well, they're just not informative enough because they just tell you one thing that you're not allowed to do, but really what we're interested in is a question of when is it permissible to have a belief and when not. And so that, as well, we need something more like a necessary and sufficient condition, rather than the kind of thing that the wide scope norms are giving us. Today, I will concentrate on norms concerning, as it were, permission to believe rather than obligation to believe. It seems, as it were, perhaps asking a bit much to look for cases where there's really an obligation to believe. I mean, it's not. I mean, there are examples which you might interpret that way, but I think it's a bit more plausible to focus on issues about permission rather than obligation here. And then what you find are the people thinking about necessary and sufficient conditions in terms of truth or knowledge or evidence for it being permissible to believe P. And so these are narrow scope norms because the scope of the deontic operator is just the believing. It's not the conditional connecting the believing to truth or whatever it happens to be. Notoriously, these narrow scope norms have run into various kinds of trouble. So one kind of trouble, particularly for the truth norm, has to do with more paradoxes, propositions of the form P and I lack the belief that P, that sort of thing. Because those can be true, but if you were to be, those propositions can be true, but if you were to believe them, they would be false because if you believed them, you'd believe the first conjunct, which would falsify the second conjunct. And so the truth norm is saying, well, if given that the more paradoxical proposition is true, then you have permission to believe it. But, of course, if you did believe it, it would be false and you'd be violating the norm. So something seems to have gone awry there. And I think more generally, one might worry about the application of these norms to propositions about your own beliefs, because we'll just take a simple setup where we've got two situations, and in situation one, there's some matter that you could easily know about. I think I'm calling it Q on the handout. It's a true proposition, but you have no belief about it because you just haven't thought about the matter, but you easily could, and then it would be obvious to you what was the case. So there's a nearby situation which you could get into just by considering this proposition Q, and it's one where very straightforwardly you believe and know Q, and you also believe that you believe Q and know that you believe Q and so on, because it's, as it were, this is something that's there in plain view. It's only a matter of turning your mind to it. And so it seems that if you're in situation one, it's perfectly permissible for you to get into situation two, for you to be in situation two, because all that requires is for you to consider the relevant proposition and then do some totally fine cognitive stuff, and that's what being in situation two involves. And so it seems that since when you're in situation one, it's permissible for you to be in situation two, and in situation two, you believe that you believe P, then it should be permissible, in situation one, it should be permissible for you to believe that you believe P. But the proposition that you believe P, sorry, I'm messing up. I'm saying P. I should be saying Q. The proposition that you believe Q is false in situation one, and you have no evidence for it. I mean, there's no sign of your believing it, and you certainly don't know that you're believing it. And so we get a violation of all three norms in the opposite direction, going from left to right. what you find in the literature on this are all sorts of ad hoc attempts to rule out these cases or to qualify the norms for these cases, and typically these attempts have to do with the special structure of these propositions about your own beliefs. That seems to me going in completely the wrong direction. I don't think that the issues here have anything fundamentally to do with the fact that these are propositions about your own beliefs. On the handout, I've set up a similar sort of case, but where the proposition to be believed is just one about whether a certain light is on, but the idea is that, if we make it science fictional, that there's some electrode in your brain which connects whether you consider whether the light is on with whether the light is on. So that if you consider whether it's on, then it goes on, but if you never consider whether it's on, it stays off. And this gives us the same kind of structure, but with a proposition whose content is just completely straightforward about the whether the light is on. And again, we have situation one where you never consider whether the light is on and it never is on, and then situation two where you do consider whether the light is on, and of course then it is on, and then you come to believe and indeed know that it's on. And again, the problem is that if you're in situation one, then it seems permissible for you to be in situation two, because all that requires is that you consider a certain proposition and then do some absolutely fine cognition, and then you, in proposition two, you know that the light is on. And so we get that since in situation one it's permissible for you to be in situation two, and in situation two you have the belief that the light is on, that it's permissible, in situation one it's permissible for you to believe that the light is on, even though, of course, in situation one the right-hand condition, the truth or knowledge or evidence, they're all violated. So this is not an issue about tricky self-reflexive contents, even though they're quite handy for raising the problem. We can raise the problem if we want to without them. And if you don't like the science fictional stuff about electrodes in the brain, then maybe a more realistic one is a case where, let's say, the proposition that you're blushing. I mean, if you seems as we're not so far from situations that one may have been in oneself, that if you don't consider whether you're blushing, then you don't blush, but if you do consider whether you're blushing, then you do blush. So we need just to understand what is going on in these cases. And I think what is going on, at least part of what's going on, is that we're not really thinking very clearly about the modal aspect of these deontic notions, such as permissibility, even though the modal aspect of it is there in your face with the construction of the word. So we're thinking in particular about the question of whether it's permissible to have a belief with respect to a situation in which you don't have that belief. And of course, the question of whether it's permissible to do something in a situation in which you don't do it is a normal one. So, that, I mean, for example, it's permissible for me to sit, even though I'm not sitting. But it seems that if we're going to think about these things, we ought to have some kind of theoretical control over what's going on with these modals, because it seems that we're dealing with cases where it's going to be highly significant what alternative possibilities are contextually relevant. And I mean, a simple way of bringing that out, which I think is in fact quite similar to what's going on with the situation 1, situation 2 case, is just to think about the two questions. I mean, supposing that that you never sit on that chair. So, if we ask the question, is it permissible for you to believe that you're sitting in that chair, then I think the natural answer is, well, no, if we're taking these norms seriously. I mean, it's not permissible for you to have that belief, because you're not, and you don't even seem to be sitting in that chair. But on the other hand, if we ask the question, is it permissible for you to sit in that chair and believe that you're sitting in it, then the natural answer is yes. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, although please not during the lecture. But if we're answering no to question 1, we're saying it's not permissible to believe that you're sitting in that chair, then how can we be answering yes to question 2, that it is permissible for you to do that, have that belief and be sitting in the chair? And presumably we're dealing with some kind of contextual shift in which situations we're considering relevant. Now, once we're aware of that issue, then it seems that we should be, in some way, factoring it into our formulation of the relevant norms if we're going for these narrow scope norms. We could try to handle it by introducing various conventions for what possible situations we're going to count as relevant for purposes of the norm. I mean, the most liberal would be to say that all possible situations are going to be counted as relevant. But I think that's not going to work at all, because it's going to make these norms non-contingent. And if they're non-contingent, then all these norms for belief will fail, because, of course, it's highly contingent whether these propositions about the world are true. In most cases, it's contingent whether you know them. It's contingent whether you have evidence for them. So we need something more restrictive than that. We could try introducing some kind of restriction to situations where the truth values of the propositions in question are the same as in the original situation. But there are various problems with that. I mean, one is that that convention is unstable as we consider more propositions, because then there'll be more things that we have to be held fixed. It also doesn't solve one of the structural issues which for the truth norm in the right to left direction, because it just because the restriction actually just makes things worse. and it just violates what it's natural to take as relevant in all sorts of situations. And then, on the hand, I consider another proposal about how we might do this, but I don't think I'm going to go through that now. So it seems to me that this sort of strategy of trying to write in explicit qualifications in order to control the range of relevant situations is going to be very messy, ad hoc, and it's not going to explain anything very much. I mean, my view is that we should take as basic the wide scope norms which do not give rise to these messy problems. And if we want to have necessary and sufficient conditions, we can still get them in a way, starting with the wide scope norms. We can get them in the following way. I mean, this will all be explicitly relativized to some class of contextually relevant situations, and we're simply leaving it to the context which they are, and then just in the natural way, we might take that the permissibility of believing P to be a matter of there being some contextually relevant situation where you believe P and you comply with the instance of whichever wide scope norm we're concerned with for P, not that you have to comply with the wide scope norm as a universal generalization. And similarly, for the obligation that one should believe P, it would be that in every relevant situation where one complies with the wide scope norm at issue for P, one believes P. And then if you just combine those simple standards for permissibility and obligation with the various candidate wide scope norms, you get the results that I've displayed at the middle of page 4 of the handout. So just thinking about the permissibility norms, the condition for the permissibility of believing P will, for the truth norm, it will be that in some relevant situation one truly believes P. For the knowledge norm, it will be that in some relevant situation one knows P. I'm assuming that knowledge entails belief, and that for the evidence norm, it'll be that in some relevant situation one believes P with evidence supporting P. The obligation conditions may look rather strange because in each case, the obligation condition is that in every relevant situation, one believes P. So that's necessary and sufficient for being obliged to believe P. I mean, but the explanation for that perhaps slightly unexpected result is quite straightforward. It's, of course, on the one hand, if in every contextually relevant situation one does believe P, then, of course, it will just trivially come out that in every relevant situation where one complies with the norm for P, one believes P. I mean, some people might think that's a very counterintuitive result because it makes all sorts of necessary things come out obligatory. I mean, my view is that that's just a sort of Gricean phenomenon that one shouldn't worry about. But if you wanted to do things in a more fine-grained where it would be possible to do it here too, I guess. And on the other hand, if there is a situation that's contextually relevant, where you lack the belief P, then that is automatically a situation in which you comply with the relevant wide scope norm, at least of those that I've been considering, because they're all norms which are vacuously satisfied for a given P if you lack the belief P. Right? So I don't think the obligation norm is really anything to worry about. Of course, what one might be concerned with is the more general worry that somehow those wide scope norms are insufficiently demanding, that maybe there are cases where something is going badly wrong, even though you comply with them, because, as it were, if it were possible to be totally agnostic, which no doubt it isn't, then you would automatically comply with all those norms just by not having any beliefs. And just to make it more specific, I mean, one might feel that that someone maybe who has political decisions to make and is confronted with a mound of evidence, let's say, for man-made global warming, and who simply refuses to form a belief either way, is doing something wrong. So one could try to beef up these norms of belief in such a way as to rule that out. Of course, it's in the global warming case, it's not so obvious that it has to be a norm of belief that does the work. I mean, you could think that at that point, genuinely moral considerations are coming into to play, and this is a case where there's a moral obligation to have a belief on the matter, and no doubt a belief that satisfies some appropriate cognitive norm. Because once we, as it were, we're considering for primary evaluation a situation in which you lack a belief, then we don't have the kind of normativity that, as it were, seems arguably to be generated by your believing something. As it were, we don't have anything that can be defective in the same sort of way. I mean, it looks as though we might have to appeal to something more like holistic norms of inquiry or something of that kind. I think it's worth comparing this with the case of promise keeping, where the analog would be someone demanding conditions in which it's permissible or obligatory to promise to phi. And I think in that case, it's fairly clear that by insisting on an account of that matter, one's going way beyond anything that is given, as it were, by the institution of promising itself. as it were, it's not the institution of promising that tells you when you should make a promise and when you shouldn't. I mean, of course, there can be situations in which there may be some moral obligation to make a promise. But that's, as it were, coming from a completely different source from the institutional obligation to keep your promise, which is, as was just internal to the institution of promise keeping. I mean, as it were, it's one thing to talk about what you're bound to do by some contract, and another thing to talk about when it's permissible or obligatory to make the contract in the first place. So one might feel that the kind of norms that it makes sense to propose in the case of beliefs that one does have, as with the wide scope norms are essentially focused on, are different from any which have to do with whether you should get into this sort of state in the first place. I mean, of course, it may be that when one considers why we have an institution of promising, that there are all sorts of considerations about the point of that institution, which also give some kind of guidance about when you should or shouldn't make a promise. But that's, as I say, is a very different matter from the issue of the norm that's just built into the institution itself. In the case of belief, one might feel that there are specifically epistemic aims which should govern the question of whether to form beliefs or not, as whether we don't have to get into moral issues in order to consider that matter. But there still seems to be some kind of distinction between aims and norms. That I mean, if there are some epistemic goods around, or goods of any kind, then they naturally give rise to aims. I mean, to obtain the good, or as much of the good as you can get, and so on. But those aims are not the same sort of thing, as far as I can see, as the kind of norms that arguably govern specific beliefs, which have to do with whether those beliefs are defective or not. And tomorrow I will try to take that line of thought further than I have today. Thank you.
Hi. So I wanted to ask about the bit at the end. It seems right to say that the kind of norms you're talking about won't give us the norm to believe something like, to take a stand on something like climate change. Do you think that, it seems like it would be compatible with everything you've said to think that, well, here's a place where we could have something that's knowledge flavored that will give you a reason to take a stand on that, which would be if there's a kind of knowledge norm on acting for reasons, since lots of your actions are plausibly predicated on something like whether or not climate change is true, then it looks like knowing in the right way for doing is going to give you what you wanted, without it being the case that the norms that you're talking about here for the individual belief do it. Does that seem right?
Yes. Yeah, so I think you could get some way with just a knowledge norm on the beliefs that were feeding into decisions about how to act. Whether it would get you as far as you really wanted is another matter, because I think as we're, I mean, we could have the person who was just generally skeptical. I mean, a lot of these sort of advertising agencies, hired. I mean, say things like our product is doubt, and which is worth remembering when one's hearing skeptics being all self-righteous about their doubt. But and so somebody could have, as it were, a whole lot of knowledge about how little they knew about these matters, and then they might take actions that were, as it were, appropriate given what they knew, and yet really what we want is for them to have gone out there and got a whole lot more knowledge and then acted on that. And so we may need some other source to drive that aspect of things.
Okay, good. Jeremy. Oh, yes, I can do other people first. Ginger. Right over there.
Hi. So I was wondering. So I'm just having trouble making sense, I think, of the wide scope norms. So I was interpreting. Maybe this is where I go wrong. I was interpreting the O as a box.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it as box-like. Yeah.
Okay. And then by just one application of K to the thing on the right, ought, BP, then P, you get ought, BP, then ought, P. And I'm just not sure what the consequent of that conditional means. It ought to be that the sun is shining.
So this is really a doubt about meaning rather than about truth, is it?
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, of course, there's the fact that we typically talk about oughts as agent-centered, that someone ought to do something. But of course, if we do that, we can. I mean, there is a sort of trivial way of, even if we're talking, saying that John, if John ought to believe that the sun is shining, then John ought to be such that the sun is shining, and it seems. I mean, I can see why you're wondering how on earth that could be, or why one might wonder how on earth that could be true. I don't really see any problem in understanding what it means, as it were, just by compositional semantics. I mean, maybe. So, and of course, since these are obligation. I mean, these norms, in fact, don't generate non-trivial obligations. It's not going to be that the antecedent is true for non-trivial sorts of reasons. And so the worry about truth doesn't seem very very pressing. But I mean, of course, it's. I mean, if we think that these are required to be agents, I mean, obviously we don't want to then to read John ought to be such. I mean, it ought to be that the sun is shining as the sun ought to be shining. I mean, the sun isn't an agent. I mean, even there, I mean, I doubt that we're really dealing with meaninglessness as opposed to just a total implausibility. I mean, after all, plenty of people have thought that the sun was a god and so an agent, and so it's not that we literally can't understand that. I'm reminded of some occasion when Bernard Williams was being presented with, with somebody was saying, "Look, I just don't understand," and he was saying, and Bernard Williams replied, "Is that a confession or a boast?"
Okay.
Kate?
You've got a notion of a belief being defective if, for example, you don't have adequate evidence for it. So I'm wondering why, in something like the climate change case, you can't say that a refraining from belief, an agnosticism, is defective. Because it would seem to me that if you had plenty of evidence and you didn't believe it, then failing to believe is itself a doxastic defect.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's a question about whether we could have norms for other sorts of states. I think, one that's been discussed quite a bit recently by Jane Friedman is suspension of belief, which she interprets as a positive state. And, well, we could, you could have the view that there are evidential requirements on that. Although, I don't think this is decisive. But of course, there are lots of situations in which we do suspend belief, even though we're aware that the evidence we have may in fact be completely decisive on one side or the other, but we just think, I don't want to think about that anymore for some reason. I think there is also, of course, the case of the person who doesn't go into a positive state of suspending belief, but just can't even be bothered to get that far. They just forget about the issue and think about something else instead. And so if we were really going to catch the climate change skeptic, we'd have to make sure that they didn't have a bolt hole into, as it were, a state where into a situation where they didn't even form a state of suspension of belief. And so in that case, we would need something like a norm for simply failing to believe. And we could consider that, although we would need. We'd need to build in all sorts of qualifications. I think perhaps for now I would just like to say, well, I will say more about that tomorrow, so that I'm not dismissing a suggestion like that, but I do think there's a problem with norms where there is no, as it were, if you like, special doxastic state that seems to be generating them in this kind of case. As in a norm that would be violated by the person who just didn't bother to think about global warming when maybe they ought to be thinking about it, but ought perhaps for moral reasons.
Okay. Jeremy? Stand by.
So I had a problem understanding the criticism of the left to right readings when you did situation 1 and situation 2 in both the self-referential version and in the version with the light on.
Yes.
I'm going to do the light on because it's easier. But this might just be a request for you to talk me through this in some different way. But as far as I understood it, and you almost write this, so I'm hoping I'm getting this correct, the idea is, in situation 1, it's permissible for me to be in situation 2.
Yes.
In situation 2, it is permissible for me to believe that the light is on. And thereby, it's permissible in situation 1, according to these norms, for me to believe that the light is on. But in situation 1, not only is the light not on, it's unsupported by evidence and all that. And so we seem to have a contradiction. Is that
No,
the
it's
structure
not
of it?
quite that. It's that it's not that in situation 2 it's permissible for you to believe that the light is on. It's that in situation 2 you do believe that the light is on.
Okay.
And then the point is that since in situation 1 it's permissible to be in situation 2,
Yeah.
and then part of being in situation 2 is that you do believe that the light is on. As it were, it follows from that it's in situation 1 it's permissible to believe that the light is on.
Can you
that's the way
explain how that last step goes? 'Cause
well,
that
so
doesn't seem to me
so
true.
well, roughly speaking, I'm assuming that if it's permissible for you to satisfy a conjunction, it's permissible for you to satisfy any of the conjuncts. And so being in situation 2 is in effect satisfying some long conjunctive description, one conjunct of which is that that you believe that the light is on.
Okay, so I'm in situation 1. It is permissible for me to be in situation 2, right? And thereby it's permissible. I'm not sure I can do this. I just don't understand how the following isn't the right thing to say. So maybe this will work. I would have thought the right thing to say is I'm in situation 1. It's permissible to be in situation 2. And so in situation 1, it's permissible for me to know that. Were I in situation 2, it would be permissible to believe this. That's not the inference I'm getting at.
No, that's not that's
the one I
not
would
the
have thought.
inference that's at issue. It's just that there's in situation 1, it's permissible for you to be in situation 2. Being in situation 2 is a matter of satisfying a bunch of things. And so in situation 1, it's permissible for you to satisfy any one of that bunch, and one of that bunch is believing that the light is on.
Okay, so it might be that the problem is I don't actually think you can get from the move that if in situation 1 it's permissible to you to be in a conjunction. All right, I can't ask this question, but I think I actually understand the disagreement here because I'm thinking if I'm permissible to be in a conjunction, but it's not obviously the case that just satisfying any one of them is permissible in situation 1. It might be the case you can only satisfy all of them. The problem is you can't both be in situation 1 and in situation 2 in this case because of the other conjunct.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, so I'm taking it that the permissibility, as a modal operator, has a diamond-like behavior,
Yeah.
and from from possibly P and Q, it follows that possibly P. Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, one can put together things that may look like counterexamples to that, but I think some Gricean thing is going on or something like that in those cases. And this is not an idiosyncratic view of mine about the logic of permissibility. It's fairly standard.
Yeah.
Slim?
So in a way, mine is a follow-up on Jeremy's. So I still was having trouble with this argument. and I think now this is really identified like a choice point. So here's a possible narrow scope view. They just deny that deontic permissibility of the epistemic sort binds operators. They think it just, it's epistemically permissive for you to believe something or to suspend judgment, not to make it the case that P, where P is a claim about you believing, okay? That's a view. Many ethicists have that view with regard to the ought that pertains to action. And they view people who take the opposite view as just trying to sort of like do damage to this other notion so they can get Ecriptian semantics on it. And if you had that view, then I think you just deny that it's permissible to be in situation 2 in the relevant sense of permissibility, because it's not, it's not, I mean, the epistemic permissibility of the sort that we're talking about is not the type that sort of, that takes something propositional as its object. So now, does this mean at this point we just kind of, we have to argue about this other issue in order to then apply your argument? Or, because I think it's worth noting that a lot of your opponents who want to go in for narrow scoping are going to go the other way on that background assumption.
I mean, I don't see that even as we ordinarily talk about permissibility, that this is really, as we're going beyond the bounds of that. It's, I mean, it can be permissible to be on the grass. It can, and I don't see that permissibility of being on the grass is so different from the permissibility of being in some given situation. I mean,
Okay.
I mean, and
I don't think it's epistemically permissible to do things. I don't think it's epistemically permissible to be on the grass. So I shouldn't be speaking my voice, but it's a possible view that a lot of people hold that don't think there's epistemic assessment of things other than doxastic attitudes. And so on that view, you couldn't, I mean, there's also things to say about what you've just been saying with regard to like oughts that pertain to action. There's a whole big debate about that.
yeah, I mean, I think there would be difficulty in developing, any really systematic view that actually corresponded to the semantics of permissibility along those lines. I think that. I mean, just the compositional semantics is going to make these. It's going to give some kind of meaning to these, and the just general logical requirements are going to get things working the way that I've been talking about. And I mean, I think it's also, it's not, I mean, for what it's worth, I think it's not the case that people generally have been appealing to some very special notion of permissions here. And I think as I said, there are all sorts of ways in which if it's if we can talk about if it's permissible to do this, it's permissible to do this, to be in at least one of these states and so on. And so it seems that these restrictions are coming from some kind of background theory that, as far as I can see, is not really, it doesn't really correspond to the notions that we're talking about, with these natural language constructions. I mean, if somebody wants to come up with some special notion that doesn't work this way, I mean, they can have a go. But I mean, maybe you want to press a bit more on this.
But I mean, my main question was just whether you agree that we have to go your way on this other dispute. And it seems like you're agreeing we have to in order to follow your argument.
Yeah.
And now you're fighting this other dispute.
Yeah. So I mean, certainly I have been using some logical principles about permissibility that are in the argument that I was giving. Yeah.
I mean, my initial point was also that most narrow scopers go the other way in that debate. So in a way, it's sort of like that's the real fight. And I'm not sure I'm convinced that natural language on your side, I mean, this is basically connecting back to Ginger's point. I mean, there are these constructions where it looks like it's weird to say, you know, it ought that P when there's no agent at all involved in the P, but it looks like this sort of way of doing these semantics that you attracted to is committed to that making sense. So usually people end up saying, oh, it's just an artifact of English that we don't talk that way. And that always gets me a little worried when it's such an artifact of English that's such a deviation, you know. Language is pretty adaptable over time. And usually when when sort of professional philosophers end up saying it's an artifact of English that we don't talk some way, time doesn't bear that out. So
But I mean, so the ought. I mean, ought to be so and so. I mean, someone ought to be such that. It seems to be. It's kind of rather a laboured way of talking, but it's perfectly well formed. And participants in the debate are. They're typically perfectly willing to talk about both obligations and permissions to believe, and to treat those as dual, so that they are in fact talking about permissions not to believe as well, and so they are in fact more liberal than just, as it were, treating ought to believe as some kind of fused thing which can't be further analyzed.
one can go that way without taking the thing. I mean, it can be that it binds a doxastic state, and the doxastic states can have structure, so you can get an analog of dual, and so on. Similarly, you can have actions, you can have omissions, which is like the analog, without having to go in for strict propositionalism about the content of oughts. Well, I mean, there's a lot of possibilities here, but I feel like I've gone on for too long.
Should we move on?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you pass back to Dilip?
This is connected, I think. So the narrow scope, the person who supports the narrow scope evidence norm. So when you ask this question, is it permissible to believe that you're sitting in that chair? Initially, when I hear that question, I hear it as sort of, is it permissible, given your evidence, for you to believe that you're sitting in that chair? And so here's just the question. So one way to restrict the contextually considered situations would be to demand that they be ones in which the agent's evidence doesn't change. It remains the same across those situations. And in most of your cases, like in the light case, in the actual situation, there's no light in your visual field, and then you're permitted to be in this other situation. I agree that you're permitted to be in that situation, but it's a situation in which your evidence is different because there's this light in your visual field. But for the relevant notion of permissibility, maybe it could be brought out by saying, given your evidence, is it permissible for you to believe this? And then the fact that you're permitted to be in a situation in which the light comes on is irrelevant.
Yeah, well, but I don't think that that's the general way that these issues are being understood, because people who are sympathetic to some version of the truth norm and they're not really interested in the evidential situation. So, I think that's a specific gloss that one could have on which situations one's going to treat as as relevant, but it's not as it were part of the rules of the game. I mean,
But just suppose, okay, forget about everyone else and just focus on the narrow scope evidence person. Is there something wrong with that version of the narrow scope view? Or?
Well, I mean, one thing, of course, is that the situations, I mean, take a case where somebody doesn't believe, and then if they were to believe, their evidence would be different as well. Right, and because their evidence would include I mean, let's assume that if they were to believe, they would be aware of believing, and so the fact that they believed would itself be part of their evidence. And so, it might be that there would be no relevant state in which they both believed P and had the same evidence as they actually have, and I mean, it could even be in some cases could be constitutive, because it could be, well, for example, I mean, it would depend on just how you thought of the evidence, but I mean, supposing that the evidence propositions are required to be true, then it might be that in the original state, it's a state where your evidence includes the fact that you lack the belief P, right? And so, then since evidence is required to be true, it would be a state in which you did lack the belief, and any state in which you had the same evidence would have to be a state in which you lacked the evidence. And so, I think if you really require the evidence to be fixed, then that will be so restrictive that I think you will often exclude this kind of situations that you want where the person has the belief.
So you'd still get cases where you're permitted to believe, but the norm would say otherwise? Or?
Well, I mean, so that if permitted to believe meant that there was some situation in which some permissible situation in which you believed P and had the same evidence as you currently have, then there might just be no such situation, and so it would come out as impermissible to believe.
David?
Yeah, it's going to turn out to be the same question in slightly different language. I just wanted to push a little bit on the charge of ad hocery. So there's this objection narrow scope norms that if you look at Q equals P and not believe P, it's very hard to know what to say about these without modifying your norms. And the thought is that a modification here would be ad hoc. And I was just thinking about one reason it might not be ad hoc is because this is a special case in which what you believe about Q changes the world in a way relevant to the goodness of your belief that Q. So the relevant analogy here, it seemed to me, was decision theory. 40, 50 years ago, we had this question. Suppose taking a certain action would change the world in ways relevant to the goodness of the action. How should we treat these cases? And the response there was causal and evidential decision theory. We treated these cases differently. And the thought is, would it really be so ad hoc to do something similar just for cases like the one you're bringing up? And if so, maybe is there another counterexample that would get around this kind of a worry?
Well, I mean, ad hoc is not the same as unmotivated. And, of course, you know, there was motivation for adding epicycles to Ptolemaic astronomy, but it was still it was still some kind of ad hoc move. I mean, you know, I think a lot here depends on what the competitors are. I mean, suppose that there was some decisive reason for rejecting the wide scope norms, so that as with the narrow scope norms were the only game in town, then we might just have to modify them, you know, in whatever way was required. But given that the wide scope norms are still available, then the fact that as we're going the narrow scope way is forcing us into all sorts of complicated contortions. You know, it's a reason for preferring the wide scope path. So, as it were, I mean, I think the right way of understanding these is as comparative remarks between the two options, rather than as something that would suggest that we'd be better off having no theory at all than having the narrow scope theory modified in these complicated ways.
Susanna?
Tim, I wanted to go back to the issues about agnosticism. So you distinguished two kinds of agnosticism, the kind where you're considering a matter but suspending, and then the other kind where you don't even get that far.
Yeah.
You said it's just off your radar. And then you had mentioned two norms that potentially police, I guess, both kinds. There were moral norms that you mentioned in the climate change case, and then there were holistic norms of inquiry. And given the differences between the two kinds of agnosticism, I guess it wouldn't be entirely surprising if there were different norms policing both kinds. So one thing I was just wondering is whether you think they're going to be the same norms policing both kinds of agnosticism or different ones. And I also wondered what you might think about some perceptual cases where someone just refuses to believe their eyes, you know, for no discernible reason, and it doesn't have to be that there's anything moral at stake,
Yeah.
And it also doesn't have to be embedded in any larger inquiry. So do you think there might be some now third norm that's governing, I guess that would be just one of the kinds of agnosticism in the perceptual case?
Yeah, so, I mean, so something seems to be going wrong in something bad about the case of the person who, just for no special reason, refuses to believe their eyes some capricious way. I don't think that we automatically have to think of that in the sense. I mean, the kind of normativity there might not be, as it were, the kind where there's, as it were, a special ban on something, because I mean it could be, you know, another way that we could think about this is just that knowledge, for example, or you might go for some other state, but let's say knowledge is a good and there's a there's something general bad about as when something good is available to you, for very easily, that you just turn your nose up at it, as it were. But that wouldn't have to be because there's a ban on doing that, as opposed to that, as it were, that is not what somebody with good cognitive dispositions will do, or something of that kind. So that's what I've said. That's not to exclude the possibility of, as it were, the kind of stricter ban conception. But I'm not convinced that we actually need that.
How about the other question about whether you think there's different norms for the different forms of agnosticism?
Yeah. Well, I think it's. So if the norms are thought of in this stricter sort of way, then what I've been saying is that I'm not convinced that we have to do either of these cases in terms of a norm that, as it were, just bans such behavior, or as it were, treats such it as kind of defective. But I think that. If we were going to do it in terms of norms, then the case for doing that with a specific propositional attitude of suspension of belief seems more promising than the case of somebody who just simply for whom this just isn't on their intellectual horizon at all, because there would be, as it were, there would be a specific intentional state, and then the question would be whether there was something defective about that state. And so, as it were, it's certainly much closer to the kind of belief case than the case where there just is no state there at all, where the question may not have occurred to somebody, even though in some sense it ought to have done.
There's a way of analyzing the perceptual case in something that looks like a wide-scope way, because you could say you just shouldn't be in the situation where you have an experience that P, but you don't believe P, given some other conditions. Like,
yes,
but,
yeah, no, I agree.
In a certain way that's
yes.
friendly to you, and in another way, maybe because of some of your other commitments,
Yes.
it isn't that friendly to you.
Yes, so it's not that somehow, as well, that a commitment to doing things in a wide scope way is excluding these norms. It's not obvious to me that we need them. But I should say that this is this is quite exploratory. So it's not at all that I want to exclude that. I'm just not yet convinced of the need for a norm of that kind. But maybe I can be convinced.
Kevin?
Thanks. Question along a similar line. I got the idea that, okay, well, if there's no belief there, then maybe it's hard to see what's going to generate a norm to kick in. But there are ways around that in particular cases, right? I want to know whether Williamson's in Harvard. I know that Jack knows Williamson's in Harvard, but I don't have any belief. And it seems like, well, there's a particular belief we can point to. Well, my belief or my knowledge that Jack knows this thing that generates that seemed like a paradigm case where you'd want to say my lack of belief is defective in some way. And I'm just curious if you didn't want to say that, if you want to say, oh, well, similar, it's like there's a good open view that's accessible that you could take. I'm just sort of wondering what's at stake between that position and the person who says, no, there's a norm that kicks in that says, here, you ought to believe.
Yeah. So, I think we can all agree that there's something bad about these cases, and the question is what. and so if you take the analogy with promising, I mean, which of course is itself, it's not. I mean, it might not be the right analogy, but supposing we just take it that there the norm of promise keeping seems to be something that is built into the institution, and it's as it were, in some way it's what makes promising what it is, or something like that. And whereas, I mean, there may be all sorts of situations where somebody, let's say, refuses to make a promise, even though their loved one is saying, promise you won't leave me, or whatever it is, and they firmly intend not to leave the loved one, and making the promise is something that they could easily do without compromising anything, and yet they just don't bother to make the promise. I mean, that's surely a situation in which this person is behaving badly. But we don't need to postulate some second norm of promising in order to explain what's bad about that. We should be able to explain on more general grounds what's going wrong there. And in these other cases, I mean, I do think that we are going to need to get some other pieces on the table in order to give a full account, and so one possibility would be something like if we're just thinking in epistemic terms, it would be the value of knowledge, which I don't think is the same as some kind of norm that bans being in certain states or something. And I mean, in the case you were suggesting, it was also a case where the person, strongly desired, for reasons best known to themselves, to know on this matter. So there was a specific aim that they had, which they were in a position to satisfy without any trouble, and yet they're just perversely not taking the means to that end, and so on. So in a case like that, it's not clear that there's any explanatory need to postulate a special norm to explain what's going on there. Whereas the idea is that maybe we do need to have some kind of norm of belief in order to understand, that will in some way be part of a constitutive story about what belief is. I mean that's not something that I have argued positively here, but it's definitely supposed to be, as it were, something in the background of a lot of these accounts about norms of belief.
Jack?
I wanted to ask about the derived narrow scope norms on page 4, and specifically the permission one.
Yep.
So your condition requires only a very tenuous connection between compliance and belief. So the fact that there's some relevant situation where I comply with the wide scope norm for P and believe that P is compatible with it being the case that in almost all the relevant situations where I believe that P, I don't comply. Indeed, it's compatible with there being a low chance conditional on me believing that I comply.
Yes.
And I wondered whether you thought the truth or evidence part of the institution of belief should think that in those cases you are indeed permitted. So take the promising analogy. the case of promising, the analogy to promising. So if it's the case that in almost all of the worlds where I promise that P, I don't keep my promise, even if there's some relevant situation where I comply and do make the promise, my own intuition is that it's not okay for me. I'm not permitted to make that promise. Now, there's lots of ways to build in this kind of robustness from a wide scoper's kind of point of view, and you didn't go in for that way. So I guess my question is, maybe we have different intuitions, but why not make that connection more robust?
Because I think that involves just, as it were, adding complications to the norm for things that can be explained without complicating the norm. So just to vary the analogy again, take cases where I can legally get from A to B, even though, as it were, there's only one very narrow line that will take me legally from A to B, and and if I stray off that one line, I'll be walking in forbidden areas or whatever it is. Then it's still consistent with the law for me to go from A to B. It's something that's legally permitted, and of course, suppose that this is, suppose it's very important for me to comply with the law, perhaps because I'll be instantly executed if I violate it, and so, if I'm thinking about whether to go from A to B, the fact that it's extremely likely that if I attempt to, I will, in fact, stray off the straight and narrow line and violate the law and be executed or whatever it is. That is a very relevant consideration, but it would be quite the wrong move to say so we have to, as it were, understand that as part of the content of the law. Right? The law is just very straightforward that you can go from A to B as long as you stick to this narrow line, and then everything else is, as it were, further reflection on what it's sensible to do, and of course, we might feel that somebody was not showing proper respect for the law if they did something which was extremely likely to involve a violation of it. But unless there's some meta law about that, then they can still be complying with the law and so doing something that's legally permitted when they take these huge risks in going from A to B. And it seems to me that that's the same situation with promising. So, and in fact, in the case of promising, I don't even think that there's an ought implies can sort of principle here. So, I'm not sure if this will help, but maybe if I say this anyway, so that, for example, if I, well, I'll say this. I'm not sure that how relevant this is to what you're thinking. But if I promise my son to give him, a round square toy for his birthday, then, although of course it's the fact that it's impossible for me to do so has got nothing to do with. I'm still obliged to give it to him, and if I when I don't give him a round square toy for his birthday, and he complains that I didn't, I cannot say, look, it's impossible to have a round square toy, so and ought implies can, so I was under no obligation to keep my promise. I mean, that's he's going to be rightly outraged by that because I made the promise and I was bound by it, and I think there's that kind of, as it were, very straightforward nature to the promise keeping norm itself. And then everything else has to be understood in terms of calculations on top of that about the risks of violating the norm. But those further calculations shouldn't be built into the content of the norm. I mean, I think, as it were, one will get into some sort of infinite regress of complications if you start building those kind of extra prudential contents into the considerations into the content, because then once you put them into the content, they will generate further considerations ad infinitum. So it's better just to keep the content simple, and well, as the thing that Austin quotes, my word is my bond. That it's the avert thing that is what you're obliged to do, and I think something similar happens with the belief norms as well.
I think we can squeeze in one last question. Justin.
Hi. I've got a question which I think is in the same general area as Susanna's, but of a different kind in detail. I'm wondering about the parallel between promising and believing. And I'm thinking it makes very good sense to make a distinction between what's integral to the practice and what, on the other hand, might be norms governing entry into the practice and some other things too, in the case of promising. But there are some disanalogies between the cases that make it less clear that that's a fundamental or fundamentally usable distinction in the case of believing. What I'm thinking about is there's, in a sense, nothing wrong with people who never go in for promising. They just might not have it in the vocabulary of their particular society, and there's probably nothing very wrong with people who, I mean, there may be something wrong, but maybe there isn't, or at least there's a different problem with people who just are very unsure about how reliable they will be in the future, so they hold back from promising on any significant matter, and so on. But in the case of believing, the most fundamental cases are ones where, in some sense, it's not up to us. I mean, you yourself started out by saying you want belief to be a state that is found in young children and in animals. And it strikes me in that case that the most fundamental cases are ones where there's, so to speak, not much question about whether you, so to speak, can get into it or not. You're in it right away.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, yeah, of course it's right that cats and dogs can't make promises. But, so this, I mean, there's certainly a way in which the analogy doesn't go all the way, and it's not remotely probative, but I think I mean, I find it a helpful analogy in thinking at least how it's possible for there to be such differences between, as it were, the norms which are internal to the thing itself, and then and how totally different types of consideration can apply from the outside. And so, I'm not expecting anybody to think, well, if promising is like that, then believing should be like that too, because I mean that would be obviously be a more than dodgy inference. But I think it's as it were, it's helpful just in grasping, the possibility that belief is like that. And of course, there's the old issue about whether there can be norms of belief given that belief is only in very limited ways subject to the will. But that was why I mentioned notions like defectiveness and the distinction between something functioning well and something functioning badly and so on. And those kinds of distinctions do not require that we be dealing with things that are subject to the will. I mean, even when the will's got nothing to do with it, things can be going badly, or going wrong, or not going wrong. And of course, on that aspect, the promising is not going to help us